Hello, everyone. I am delighted to be here today with my good friend, client, and eDiscovery colleague, Ellen Blanchard, to celebrate the 8th annual World eDiscovery Day. As the Director of Discovery and Information Governance at T-Mobile, Ellen works with her team to develop defensible, repeatable, proactive discovery and information management processes and procedures that address litigation and compliance risks. Before her time at T-Mobile, Ellen spent 14 years as a securities and antitrust litigator at Boyce Schiller, where she represented Fortune 50 companies in a variety of complex litigation matters. She also spent 2 years as Associate General Counsel and Director for eDiscovery Consulting at Evolver Legal Services, where she counseled core clients to develop litigation plans and cybersecurity protections. Ellen, thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to see you.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. I know that you are incredibly active in the eDiscovery space, not only given your senior role at T-Mobile, but you also are very involved in broader industry groups, such as the Electronic Discovery Institute, the Sedona Conference, and the like. And you're a frequent speaker at conferences and on podcasts. And so you get to hear the war stories of life in the eDiscovery trenches. I'm wondering, given your depth and breadth of experience, what do you see as the biggest change or changes in the eDiscovery industry over the past 3 to 5 years?
I think it's really the technology, right? I mean, if you'd asked me 3 years ago if there were new things or new challenges, I'm not sure I would have said yes. I mean, we were pretty clear on how to produce email, office documents. Every so often you'd run across something that was unusual. But I think the sort of shift in business to other communication sources, and whether that's, text messages or WhatsApp, WeChat, things like that to communicate with customers, or internally collaboration tools like Slack, Teams, the online whiteboarding applications, or even just social media used for business purposes. That's totally changed, and every single one of those requires a totally different approach from the discovery standpoint.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I guess sort of as a logical follow-on, how do you think the pandemic impacted or influenced that change and that evolution? In other words, was it inevitable, or do you think it was accelerated or as a result of the pandemic, or was it something that was just completely unexpected?
So I think definitely accelerated. I mean, I think that we were seeing as kind of younger people were coming into the business world, that they were going to start driving some of those communications to the more instant, collaborative tools and things like that anyway. But I feel like the pandemic and the need to shift very quickly to how do we work in this remote environment absolutely accelerated that. And I think for some companies particularly may have moved it in a way that they weren't expecting, right? When you have even law firms, right? You've got a lot of senior folks who may be, resistant to the technology and things like that. I think that they just had to move in that direction because of the environment that we were in. And I think that, a lot of companies sprung up or just, kind of expanded their offerings in order to meet those needs in a way that without the pandemic, I think we'd be still a few years off from that.
So from your vantage point then, with all of these new collaboration technologies and the different ways that we're communicating with one another, what are you seeing as the biggest challenge that's facing practitioners or their internal counterparts, the in-house lawyers who are helping to manage eDiscovery and helping to manage discovery and litigations?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues is kind of the sheer number of different platforms and applications and things like that out there that all work in slightly different ways. And so, I mean, sure, when we got moved from paper to email, there was a handful, right? Lotus Notes, Outlook and things like that. But they all operated similarly, and the quirks that they had, it was only 2 that you were trying to learn. But even if you're talking about messaging applications, I think Wikipedia still lists about 200 applications, but those are the top applications. And they acknowledge that there's thousands of other applications out there. How long they store data, how the data sort of sits in the back end, which changes how you collect it, is totally different. So I think just that understand technology, and you really, even with email and the office products and things like that, you started hearing courts saying about take your geek to work and having somebody that really understands the technology. But that's even more true now. It's so complicated that even if you're using some of these tools every day, that back end knowledge of how you collect it and things like that is just, you're not going to be able to understand it without technical expertise as well.
Yeah. So I guess sort of the next logical question is for, those practitioners and their clients that are now faced with all of these different technologies and different ways that they work and different ways that they're stored, and the need to engage some sort of technical expertise in order to help them navigate that. Are there any best practices or at least some tips or tricks that you've encountered either yourself or in speaking with others that folks should consider when they're facing these types of challenges in litigation or investigation matters?
Yeah, I think recognizing that the challenges exist is a first step. I think, bringing in those experts, and whether it's law firms like K&L Gates, who have their EDAC group, who's really focused on the e-discovery and the technology side of things, as opposed to just litigation generally, or bringing in the tech partners that are really in the weeds on the, technology side of things, I think is really critical. It's no longer the situation where you could kind of go into a 26F conference or draft an ESI order without understanding or having people that understand that technology. And I think having those conversations early with the other side is really important, because you can manage a lot of these issues in terms of what's a custodian in Slack, right? Or do you really need to get mobile data? And therefore you need to look at how to preserve that data. Some of that stuff you can negotiate early so that it eases that burden downstream.
And this is sort of an impromptu follow-on, but have you seen any? Obviously, courts have started deploying ESI protocols and the like. Our district, the Western District of Washington, has one that I know is currently being looked at now. Have you started to see any ESI protocols specifically addressing this type of collaboration technology, or is it still fairly new in terms of getting those types of systems incorporated into those types of protocols and orders?
I think you'll see that they're starting to be mentioned, right? The reality is, like, the DOJ specs have had collaboration tools and text messages and things like that in their kind of description of documents for years at this point. So you're certainly seeing that in the ESI orders. What I haven't seen yet, although I'd love to see the draft for Western Washington, what I haven't seen is a really good sort of like how-to playbook for that, where they sort of mention, yeah, you need Slack, but there's so much, or Teams or any of the collaboration tools, but there's so many questions that I know the industry has around what does it mean to say, I'm going to produce Slack data for this employee? Well, is that every channel they're part of? Is that, all of the linked attachments in Teams? Is that shared email boxes in Teams? Like, how does that really work? And I have yet to see a really good model order that goes into some of those details, like some of them do around search terms and TAR and things like that as well. So I think it'll take a little bit of time, but I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah, I agree. I think that overall, it would be incredibly complicated, right? Given what you said earlier in our discussion, knowing all of the different types of tools that are out there and all of the different ways in which this data is created and stored to craft an ESI protocol that accounts for all of them appropriately. But I'm anxiously looking for those sorts of things. So we'll collectively keep our eyes out for those. Well, recognizing that it's impossible, of course, to predict the future, particularly in the e-discovery industry, one that's evolving as rapidly as this one is, especially right now, where do you see the industry headed in the next 3 to 5 years? Are there any new technologies that you think we should keep an eye out for, or any key issues that have yet to be determined by a court that could have a significant impact on the way in which we've tackled some of the challenges that you've described?
Yeah, I think there's two key things that I see. And the first is definitely the technology, right? I think we're going to get clarity around what's a custodian, or what do we have to do with linked documents? Like, what are those protocols that come into play? So I think we're going to start seeing some of that, and whether that's in the cases and the decisions coming out of the courts, or in, kind of practical guides coming from some of the, organizations and industries that you've mentioned. I also think that one of the bigger issues is around the volume of data we have. I mean, it's just exploded. But what we are seeing is that these new privacy laws are coming into play, and corporations are really having to evaluate how much data they have, how long they're storing that data, what platforms they're using, because that, ties into the security and things like that. So I do think that we'll see some push on the corporate side to minimize the data, particularly in some of these collaboration tools and things like that as well, that I think will help with trying to kind of manage how what this looks like in the e-discovery world. But absolutely, I think we're in some ways kind of at that same point we saw where we moved from boxes into email, right? Where it used to be you had official records were the paper copies of things, and then eventually it got to be, okay, well, an electronic copy is an official record. And I think emails and things like that could be evidence, and I think now you're going to start seeing that around these collaboration tools. And as a result, you're going to have to get the guidelines around how do you produce that? What does it mean to produce it and review it and things too?
Yeah, absolutely. And as an anecdote, right? I mean, I do think too that people are used to using these types of collaboration tools in their personal lives, right? And in very informal contexts. So I think one of the other challenges that are potentially facing organizations is to educate employees on the importance of the same rigor that you use to craft email messages with the right tone and tenor and content has to also be applied in this more informal communication context. And so I think there's that issue layered on top of it as well.
Absolutely. Well, and especially when you add in some of the emojis and pictures and images and things like that you just never really, had even an email earlier, but that can just change that context. And it can be very different in, different cultures as well. So how do those pieces play out too? And you're right. I think the education and training of, the employees is going to be critical.
Ellen, thank you. This has been a great discussion. It's been wonderful hearing your insights and perspectives on these important issues impacting our industry. It's evolving incredibly rapidly, and it's been and continues to be fun to navigate this stuff with you. So thank you again, and happy eDiscovery Day, everyone.
Happy eDiscovery Day.